Thanks. Good afternoon. Welcome back to those of you that have joined us throughout today. It feels like we've got 17,000 events on today, but I'm really enjoying it. So thank you for staying with us. And for those of you that have just joined us this afternoon, welcome to Toynbee Hall. We are delighted to have you there. So for the last 139 years, Toynbee Hall has been steadfast in our mission, standing shoulder to shoulder with individuals facing poverty, injustice, and striving to create a fairer world. Each and every year, we support over 25,000 people grappling with an array of issues from debt and welfare benefits to housing, employment, and immigration. We pride ourselves in delivering comprehensive support to those most in need, and we don't stop at advice. We also promote community-led research, campaigning for change, and ensure that the power for transformation remains in those residents that live locally. And all of that happens right here on our estate here at Commercial Street, where we continually host a range of free, inclusive community activities that are open to everyone, fostering spirit, unity and support. Now, we're gathered here today just a few days after Pride in London and the end of Pride Month. And it's an important time of reflection and affirmation for the LGBTQIA+ community, and indeed for all of us. This time of year brings my own identity as a gay man into reflection for me as well. Being able to be my true, authentic self at home and at work truly enriches my life, both culturally and socially. Yet, at the end of Pride Month, when that confetti fades and the glitter settles, there's always a lot for me to reflect on as well. Over the last 50 years, Pride has achieved significant milestones for the LGBTQIA+ community. The movement has grown from a small gathering of activists to a global celebration of our diversity, equality, and fight for LGBTQIA+ rights. What started in June 1969 with the Stonewall Uprising, a raiding of a popular gay bar in New York, became an annual tradition, and by the 1980s had adapted into a platform with activism, raising awareness about HIV and AIDS, and advocating for healthcare access, fighting against discrimination and stigma. In the 1990s, it focused on achieving legal protections and anti-discrimination laws. And in the 2000s, the focus turned on to equal marriage equality. Recent years have seen Pride look to the intersectional activism and further address challenges faced by those in the transgender community. Now, Toynbee Hall has always stand testament to the belief that individuals can make a massive, significant difference in their communities. We remain committed to addressing social inequalities and empowering marginalised groups, carrying forward the spirit of our founders and their commitment to creating a fairer and happier society. So thank you for joining us here today. Personally, thank you. Our panel discussion today is really important on the much overlooked topic of debt problems, the cost of living crisis within the LGBTQIA+ community. In a second, I'll introduce you to our esteemed panelists who are not just experts in their respective fields, but also torchbearers on the ongoing journey of Pride. They bring a wealth of knowledge, personal experience, and much needed perspectives that will help us navigate what is often quite a complex landscape. The LGBTQIA+ community is vibrant, diverse and resilient. We have to be. But many of us are facing increasing financial pressures put alongside discrimination, disparities in employment opportunities and wages, housing insecurity, as well as accessing healthcare. These can amount to real barriers. At Toynbee Hall, we're committed to doing our part in tackling these financial pressures, advocating for those who are too often unheard. So please put your hands together and welcome my esteemed panelists. Bisi Alime. Bisi is a Nigerian gay rights activist, public speaker, actor, and blogger. Leon Wald, CEO at My Bank, charity trustee, and author of the Young Trustees Guide. Andrea Leanne, a poet, author, founder, and poetry, the LGBT Open Mic Night. And Ula Christian Udair, Jonseir, author, feminist, and trans activist from Iceland. Please welcome our panel. I lost it. Oh, my chain's attached to the mic. Thank you. I tried to be fabulous and it all goes wrong. There we go. Thank you again so much for joining us on a really crucial issue. And I'm delighted that we can have this important discussion here at Toynbee Hall. I suppose to kind of open with our question, what is it do you believe that is the most pressing issues facing our LGBTQIA plus community today, and how do you think we can address that?
Okay, since we're still thinking,
Jump in.
I'll go fast. I think you said it very well towards the end of your presentation, and I don't think we can underestimate the warfare that the community is facing when it comes to trans rights. And I don't think that, and I know a lot of people will kind of want to disagree with me, I don't think that there is anything as important at the moment within the LGBTQI plus movement that can overtake the aggressive and coordinated attack on trans rights in this country. And I know that, we have the issue around poverty, around cost of living crisis, around homelessness within young LGBTQI plus people. But even if you look at that data that is coming out, the most affected people are the young trans people. And I think that is something that we do really need to take a pause and ask ourselves as a community, how did we get here? And that is very important.
True. Thank you.
No, I fully agree. I think all of these things, the way the media is, the politics is when it comes down to trans rights and trans people is really negative and really aggressive and really toxic. And I think that contributes to trans people being really disenfranchised when it comes down to poverty and hate crime, and people not being able to access healthcare. All of these different things make trans people even more vulnerable in society. And I think that in the UK, at least now, seems to be an area which is being targeted quite heavily. Also in the US, we've been seeing all sorts of, I think there's over 400 legislations in 2023 alone that have been put forward in the US Senate that has something to do with taking away rights from trans people. And sometimes they've been successful, sometimes it's been pushed back, but over 400 bills have been published just on trans rights alone in 2023. So it's really, really shocking to see how we've come to this place where trans people are just a target for everybody to attack at the moment, I think.
And it's worrying too, right? Because we've also seen that narrative in the media in the UK at home, although we haven't seen that legislatively change as they have in the US, that constant hammering of the press about that. How is that impacting? I suppose, how can allies best support the whole LGBTQIA plus community, but specifically those from the trans community?
I mean, I think people need to think for themselves a little bit more sometimes, because when you see the media and all these articles, people need to stop and think, what is actually going on here? What is the point of this? Because I walk down the street and I swear every time I'm walking down the street and I see a newspaper, there's a negative article about trans person or trans people constantly. And people need to stop and think, why is this happening? Who is gaining from this? And what are we being distracted from? Because it is a distraction. Because we have a cost of living crisis. We have a climate crisis. We have austerity. We have people living in poverty. It's a distraction from things that are actually affecting all of us, because instead of politicians and the government and all these people addressing those systematic issues in our society, they say, hey, look at this trans person instead. And it diverts the attention away from them. So sometimes feel like we get dragged into a moral panic, don't we? And we just think that trans people are, the cause of all the ills in the whole world. And it's really, really frustrating. I mean, I've seen people compare trans people to climate change. And I'm just like, it's gotten so ridiculous that I just wish people would stop and think for themselves sometimes and think, what is going on here? Who's pushing this narrative? Who's gaining from it? Because no one's gaining from it. Not trans people, not the rest of society, not LGBT people. No one's gaining from this at all.
Okay. Thank you.
I think if I can just chip in, first of all, thanks very much for the invite and for having me here. I think something that I'm worried about is the sort of look over there approach. I can't remember which Drag Race star it was.
It was from RuPaul.
Yes, look over there, which is, look over there at what's going on. Whilst the lack of leadership that we see from people who very easily want to pretend to be allies to the community if you look at people like Rishi Sunak, who recently was caught on camera joking about trans people, that lack of leadership, whilst also saying, look over there at all these things that are going on in a really small percentage or really small in size community that doesn't affect most people's lives, that provides a pathway to more dangerous politics and more dangerous rollback of legislation. So whilst we're not seeing it in the UK yet, I'm fearful, I suppose, of what the pathway is at the moment. And it doesn't take us, we don't have to look too far to find those examples just given by the US, who I would say are further down the path than we are in terms of the look over there approach. And I guess for those of us that are in the community and for those that are on the periphery of the community as our support and our allies, really it's about keeping one eye on the future and not being too distracted by what's happening now. Actually, it's the two together. And for me, I do think it's right for the country to call out the lack of leadership that we see in this area. But I would say that it's actually mainly in England. I live in Wales generally, and I was just showing the other panelists upstairs a video of the First Minister of Wales talking, direct to camera, really passionate. All three of us watched it for sort of the full 3 minutes. And the First Minister was there in his rainbow tie, whatever, talking about making Wales the safest country for LGBTQIA plus people in the world. It's the only part of the UK that has a action plan for LGBTQ people. So I think there is something that we can learn from countries close to home, as well as countries that are far, far away. And in my some previous experience, I've worked in the Commonwealth space. And what we're seeing in Uganda at the moment in particular is worrying, with the further rollback of legislative rights and affairs on that, but also real targeted interventions and attacks on that community. So I'm a bit worried about kind of what's happening all over the globe. But from a UK perspective, there are some green shoots of good stuff happening in Wales, a little bit in Scotland, and increasingly in Northern Ireland. But what's happening over my border here in England, I think is a cataclysmic failure of leadership for politicians to lead the narrative on this properly. But you'll always see them at Pride and sort of rainbow washed. So I do think we have to perhaps be a bit more skeptical than I naturally am, which is a real shame. But
yeah, I would like to add as well. I think one of the things that I've noticed that's quite worrying is that it's almost like there's a us and them approach to our LGBT community. Like, there is so much lack of understanding about LGBT experiences and lived experiences and our contributions. Like, there's so much, it's a lack of understanding. I think the threat for us is that people are so worried about what to say and how to not be offensive that people are internalizing and holding things that they want to discuss but not sure how to say it. Yeah. And I think that's been quite a challenge for all of us, because in some times of the week I'm in straight spaces, and sometimes I will choose to come out as a lesbian, and sometimes I would choose to not say that part of my identity. And I find that in spaces where I'm around heterosexual people and they think that I am heterosexual too, they will loosely say like some really problematic things. And for me, that's quite worrying, because there's so much to unpick and discuss, and people are worried about what to say and whether they're being offensive or not, that they're holding on to views that are not even accurate, or even like I have to question, without outing myself in those situations, I have to question where those thoughts come from. Yeah. Like, it's really quite worrying, because where I've been in like heterosexual spaces and queer spaces. I spend a lot of time in queer spaces where I feel like we're in this little bubble and all my friends are gay and all of this stuff is, we're in this little bubble. And then when I'm part of other spaces, it's like, actually, we have a problem in our society with just basic conversation and lack of empathy, compassion, and understanding for each other.
And it's hard, right? Because there's always that thing where we're in predominantly heterosexual spaces where you have to ask yourself, like, how out am I going to be today? Is this a safe space to be out in, or am I suddenly going to be excluded from this conversation, or people turn their back? Like, it can be quite hard to create that safe space. So lots of allies in the room today and watching and streaming live online, what advice would you give to allies watching around how to keep those spaces as inclusive and welcoming as possible? What would make us feel more safe?
What would make us feel more safe?
You know what? I just want to pick up on something that you said, Andrea, about people not being able to say what they want to say. I find this as a very lame excuse when people come up with that argument that, oh, you know what, we're not in a country where we can say whatever we want to say. And I say it.
They say it anyway.
No, but say it, and in that moment, listen to yourself. This is 2023. Just yesterday, the Independent outed the Department for Work and Housing because they were using the N word. This is 2023. The Department for Works and Pension was using the M word in classification of Black people in this country. Is that what they want to say? Say it. Because I think we need to start having very honest conversation when people say, well, but we can't say what we want to say. Because there are things I could say to you. Do you want me to say it? How's it going to make you feel? Let's start saying what we want to say and turn this whole society on its head. Let's go back to, that's what the right wing love to say, the good old days. Let's go back to the good old days when women are in the kitchen and are not allowed to do any other thing, and they're supposed to present themselves prim and proper to their husband after spending hours in the kitchen and cooking. Let's go back to the good old days when the men have to go into the coal mines and drag out the coals and get their lungs stuffed. Let's go back to the good old days, because that's what people talk about. Donald Trump will stand up and say, let's bring back the good old days. Is that what we want to talk about? What saddens me, I'm from Nigeria, right? What saddens me about this country is because I grew up with the illusion that this is a very enlightened society. They have Oxford, they have Cambridge, they have LHC, they have all of this institution of education that as a little child growing up in Nigeria was something that I aspire to have access to. There was something that I want to be part of. I look at people here as people that have, that have this level of exposure, of thinking, of thoughts. And then I get here. I'm kind of like, hello, wait a minute, what's happening? I can even think better than you. Hello. And that for me, it's something that we do need to, it's a culture shock for me, because I wasn't expecting what I saw here. And so when they say we can't say whatever we want to say, I don't know. But quickly on the issue that you raised about what allies can do, I think it fit back to what you said, Andrea, because there's so many times we've been in circles when things have been said. And our default reaction is, you know what? I'm just going to remove myself from this situation. And I do understand, because not everybody's as controversial as me. But there's something fundamental that late Desmond Tutu said. If you sit on the fence in the face of an injustice, you are endorsing that injustice. And I know it might be very difficult for you because you might not have the tools to engage the situation, but you need to say something, even something as simple as, really? Is enough to make that person think twice. just that word as like, really? Did you say that in 2023? Even if you don't know what the right thing to say. And it's that level of creating a space where we challenge misinformation, disinformation, stigma, hate, one day at a time, one person at a time. That's how we change the society to what we want it to be.
Thank you. And I think, as your point, like, how do we, everyone's got their opinion, and it's important that people's opinions are heard and both sides of the argument, and also address the fact that not everybody within the LGBTQIA plus community has the same opinion, right? There's differences of opinion on that. So before today's event, we asked our colleagues and teams if they had any questions, and lots of the questions come from that. We've got a couple of statements which I do want to share because we promised we would, and just see as statements as opposed to questions. So the first one, 10 years ago, trans women like me were in a fairly good position with protections and growing acceptance. Since then, the campaign for self-identification has reversed process. There has been cases when people of self-ID have access to women's spaces and are harming women. When I transitioned, I was abused on the street, and now self-ID is threatening to take me back to that world. And I'll read the second one so we can address both the points that have been important points that have been raised. It's important to require someone to get a diagnosis of gender dysphoria before they can change their legal gender. This is to protect those who mistakenly think they are trans. If we have more people having reassignment surgery than regretting it, this will cause a backlash within the community and make it more difficult for those who really are trans to get the treatment they need. This is especially important for children, both trans and non-trans, as some claiming that they require a gender dysphoria diagnosis can lead to medical classification of the process. Can lead to medical diagnosis of the problem, but it is medical. Furthermore, that if gender dysphoria is not classified as a medical condition, then how are we going to persuade the taxpayer and decision makers to fund the treatment that we need on the NHS?
I think there's a lot of things to address in those two statements, because I feel like there is a fundamental misunderstanding of a lot of things in there, and it's hard to know which one to begin with. But I guess I'll start with the healthcare one about, access to healthcare and so on. And when we think just about the UK, right now, trans people who want transition-related healthcare under the NHS have to wait up to 4 or 5 years to see a single specialist. And that is completely unacceptable that people are waiting this long. So when people say, oh, people are, just getting through or getting this really fast, like people are waiting for years and years and years. And people are actually putting themselves in debt to pay for private healthcare because they can't get that to the NHS. So I think there is some sort of a fundamental misunderstanding about healthcare in some ways. And I agree that healthcare needs to be funded through insurance and the NHS and all of these things, but there's ways to do that without restricting the care. Actually, what we need is more funding for the care so that more people can get higher quality care. So when people say they want to restrict it or take things away, that's not going to solve the issue. If we have higher quality care where there's more funding and more resources, people are going to be able to access what they need sooner, and they're going to be able to make better informed decisions because they're going to get all the information that they need at the right time. And now for the self-identification one, which I find a really interesting conversation, because when people think that self-identification is a sudden issue, in the UK, essentially, trans people have had the legal right to self-identify since 2010 under the Equality Act. So when people seem to think that this is some sort of a recent issue, it really isn't. And when people talk about self-identification, what they mean is that trans people are able to change their gender markers without having a medical diagnosis from a medical professional. And that's what self-identification means, or self-determination, as it is called. There's loads of countries around the world that already have laws which allow for that. I think Argentina was the first one in 2013. There's Ireland in 2015. We have Malta, we have Denmark, we have Norway, we have Iceland in 2019. So when people in the UK get lost in these debates about self-identification, it's not really about self-identification. What people are doing is they're using the opportunity to, often I feel, peddle misinformation about trans lives and trans rights, because it always comes down to gendered spaces, doesn't it? People are afraid that if trans inclusion is made, then that means that anybody can pretend to be a trans person to enter a space. Anybody can pretend to be a trans person anywhere in the world. You don't need trans inclusion to enter a space. Men don't need to pretend to be trans women in order to abuse women. They do so every day, all day. And most women are abused by men they know, which is usually their partners, their family members, people that they already know. It's not happening in bathrooms because trans people are allowed to use them. They're taking another issue and they're applying it to something completely unrelated. And that, to me, as a survivor of abuse and harassment and someone that walks the street and is seen and perceived as a woman, is infuriating, because I feel like they're taking away an issue that's really, really important and that needs to be addressed, which is male violence, and applying that to people like me. If you put me in a room next to a man, we're going to be very, very different people. So when people apply that to me and say that I'm the same, I would like to question that they don't understand anything about trans people and they don't understand anything about my experience. I've lived the majority of my life as who I am, and it's not going to change. So when people sort of try to make self-identification the issue, it isn't. It's misinformation. It's fear. It's ignorance. It's people not understanding what's at the heart of this issue. And trans people deserve to be safe just like everybody else.
Can I just talk about the hypocrisy of space? Right. And it's about who gets the permission to exist in a space and who doesn't have the permission to exist in a space. A disclaimer, I'm not a trans person. Right. So I just want to put that there. If I am a feminine presenting trans woman, I can exist in a feminine space without telling people that I'm trans. Right? Because you wouldn't know. I walk into the space. I'm very, very feminine. I'm very feminine presenting. You don't know anything unless I tell you that I am trans. That's when you know. Right? So the politics of space is about the people that do not conform, that do not look like women. And so they create this fear because they are not specifically what we will classify as what a woman is. And they are the one that we are afraid of. Right. And I've listened a lot to TAFs when they make their argument. And when I confront them with the fact that, but if I'm a very feminine presenting woman, say, well, maybe not like you. And the hypocrisy of it is because I heard that many times as a black man. Not your kind of black is the one that we're afraid of. And I ask, what kind of black? Because I might be your kind of black today. I am somebody else not kind of black. And they will remove me from spaces because I am not their kind of black. And this is a circle that will go around in. And so for me, it's challenging. Again, and the reason why I said I'm not trans is because the conversation is coming from trans people. And it's extremely challenging because then what right do I have as a non-trans person to be telling trans people that what you're saying actually doesn't hold water? But if we put it on a scale of common sense, we know that it really does not hold water. Because again, when we talk about the issue of gender marker, we all have it on our passport. Mm. It's so simple. We all have gender markers on our passport. Does that mean that I get attacked on the street because I have male as a gender marker? And people might say, but you are trivializing a very sensitive issue. We are where we are today. I come from a country where existing as a gay man will land me in jail for 14 years. And the conversation that is going on in my country is why are gay men marrying straight women? Don't they think is wickedness? And I say, but you supported a law that says if I come out, I have to go to jail for 14 years. So I have to pretend to be straight, and part of my pretense is to marry a woman. But now you blame me for marrying women when you created a scenario where I had to marry a woman to survive. And what we're doing is we're forcing trans people to live a life that is not theirs. But when that happens, we blame them for living that fake life. I mean,
Yeah. And it's an important issue. We were having a chat just the other day, and that issue on conforming to heterosexual spaces. Andrina, we spoke about a recent experience just this week in a GP surgery where you found yourself in that exact situation.
Yeah, I was in the GP yesterday actually, and there's two things. There's another thing that I didn't mention to you about the GP, which I think will fall under allyship as well. I was in the GP practice yesterday with my partner G, and we were in there for a gynecological issue. I can't even say that word, gynecological issue. Yeah, we were in there, and it wasn't my issue, it was G's issue. And we were in the waiting area, and then the name popped up on the thing. It was like, Miss da-da-da-da-da, please go to room 5 or whatever. So we went, it was room 8 actually. Went to room 8, and G's very masculine looking, very masculine presenting, although she's very feminine. She identifies as a woman. And so we were in this waiting area, in the room 8, and I automatically sat in the patient's visitor's chair, the other chair, and G sat in the correct chair, the patient's chair, because she's the patient. And the woman looked at the computer, and she looked at G, and she looked at the computer, and then she was like, isn't this for you to sit over there? And I was like, no. So then G uncomfortably sat there and just said like, I'm a woman, and then did this, like to the lady, like I'm a woman. And it was just awkward in that it was about a minute. Awful. It felt like a minute. It might have been 30 seconds, but it felt really long and awkward. And then on the way home, we was laughing about it, but then we spoke about how the name appears in the reception waiting area. And I said to G, I said, you know what? I think it would be really easy to just have the first name and surname of the patient on that screen. Yeah. Like, why does it have to have Miss or Mr.? Because G even said to me, like, I felt so relieved when you stood up with me, because the reception area was full and people assumed it was me because it said Miss. And whereas she said if she was in there by herself and she stood up and went into room 8, like, people will be looking at her like, why is it said Miss? Like, why are you going in there? You jump in the queue. I don't know. So I think that's something that I feel like I'm going to speak to the GP surgery about. I'm going to say, if you remove the Miss thing, because not everyone identifies as looks as their gender. Do you know what I mean? And it's like, the whole thing is about inclusion and making people feel welcome. And before she's even had to go into the appointment, she's had to deal with something funny, and then having to go into the room and then having to deal with something funny. And it was like, that was just so unnecessary. It felt so unnecessary yesterday, but we spoke about it. And yeah, I think people just have the right to exist how they exist and live however they live, as long as they're not hurting anybody. I think that's the main thing. And I think if people just have more kindness towards each other and acceptance and understand the challenges that people face, then there'll be a better understanding all round. Yeah. But it's the little things, isn't it? Even with like having the Miss before the name, like, is that even necessary?
And it's always those smallest things that have the biggest effect on how somebody can feel. It might not be obvious to kind of allies in the room, but that tiny little thing that wouldn't be apparent to most people sat in that waiting room. You feel the judgments. Yeah. Like, and you don't just feel them in GP surgeries, but you feel them when you're walking down the street or you're in Westfields or somewhere. Like, that feeling of judgment, it surrounds our communities all the time. Lena, I suppose that, my bank works a lot in schools and in young people spaces. What do you see from kind of young LGBTQIA plus youth, and how is my bank supporting them?
I'll come to that in just a second, because there were a couple of things I just want to deal with, I guess, that have come up. Talking about, heteronormative spaces all the time. I checked out of a hotel this morning, checked into a hotel 2 days ago, and I'll be checking into a different hotel tonight. But the point is, I'll be with somebody, and that person is called Dan. And every time we check in, they always double take, always. Right. Like that's still something that still happens because it's two blokes checking into one room, I suppose. So there's that just happened. That's my experience from this week. But there's something in there for people who want to be allies to the community, is recognizing and understanding that coming out is something that never stops happening, happens all the time. I've only just joined my bank as their chief exec. I've been there about 4 months. On the first day, all the staff on the Teams calls, some of them in front of me in the meeting room. I had to talk about my life. I ended up talking about my partner. So instantly I'd come out to 61 people, within a couple of minutes. And whilst I couldn't necessarily feel the judgment because they're all on Teams, I'm sure some people might have had questions or comments because for the first time they've got a gay chief exec. So there's something in that. I would argue, though, that part of my legitimacy as a leader is to bring my whole self to work. There are some boundaries to that whole self, of course, but largely you bring my whole self to work so people know what's going on in my life. And I would encourage anybody in the audience who has friends or colleagues that you're working with to just ask the questions, but not in a pointed way. Most of us are happy to have conversations about our lives with you and about our experiences and come into sessions like this, of course. This is all part of your own sort of personal development and learning. The other thing I just wanted to say was just to go back to what Ugla was saying about in their response about to the statements that you posed. This year is the NHS's 75th birthday. Stuff about accessing trans healthcare is critically important, but is used by the press as a distraction. It's a look what's happening over there whilst the NHS is completely on its knees across the UK. And so this is what I'm saying about how the mainstream narrative really distracts us. It gets us to focus on these micro issues that affect a relatively small number of people, most of whom in this room, you will not ever have a conversation about trans healthcare because most of you aren't trans. So, and most of your friends and contacts and colleagues aren't. And when we spoke about the communities we exist in, most of my friends are gay men. That's just what happens in the community generally. So there's something around, interactivity between those things. Another example, which you demonstrated beautifully, I'm on the board of Refuge, the domestic abuse and violence charity, and all of Refuge's history and experience shows that the majority of women that are killed because of domestic abuse are killed by partner or former partner. Yet, if you look at the press, you would think everybody that was being killed in a domestic abuse situation was being killed by a trans partner. And so it's that look over there. And this is what I'm saying. It's everywhere at the moment, and look out for it because you'll see it. Now, to your point about my bank, which is a bit cheerier, I guess, and what we're doing for young people, my bank's a financial education charity. So we run programs for people between the ages of 7 and 25 to help them understand finances, their personal finances. And we were talking about it in the room earlier about whether people could define APR and AER. How many of you could define APR?
I'd hope some people in this room.
Couple. Nearly in every audience I am in, normally there is not a single hand. But I was in a primary school recently, and young people were role-playing being a banker, borrower and a saver. And by the end of it, they were chanting whether they want APR or AR to be high or low. So there is something in that. But in terms of what we do, we work with young people irrespective of their identity. We take a very non-judgmental approach, as I'm sure the people here do, when offering advice about finances. In terms of my bank's role supporting LGBTQIA communities, to be honest, the organization hasn't done a huge amount to date because it just works with young people. But what I'm doing, I guess, is pivoting it slightly by being a gay chief exec, speaking at stuff like this. We did a Pride blog last week, just reflecting on my own experiences growing up as a young carer and being gay and trying to navigate the world. And one of the questions my colleagues asked me was, what was how did being gay impact your experiences with personal finance? And I said, well, actually, it didn't really. It was more about being a young carer. But there is something about, as a gay leader of a charity, I guess, like I said, bringing my whole self to work and also getting the organization to think about bespoke in its programs and partnering with organizations that have more access to LGBTQIA young people than we do, because we're not the convener in that space. We can just bring really great financial education to young people. So I think that's probably where we're headed as an organization, and the way that I'm trying to blend in more diversity into the way that we work.
Thank you. And I think that bit on kind of getting education, financial education in really young is so important. And we know that, we did a panel last year with some news from Experian. Around 64% of the LGBTQIA plus community have been discriminated against because of either their sexual identity or orientation, and kind of moving that forward. But I suppose we then followed that up by asking about how, where do people turn to for advice? And unsurprisingly, people are more likely to tell their pet than their partner, right? About any financial worries that they've got. So kind of champion that bit like right here and right now and encouraging that open dialogue. Does anyone here have some personal experience of financial difficulties we have come across? And where did you turn to from advice? And Andrina?
Yeah, I've been a lesbian now for 23 years, something like that. 23 years, yeah. Long phase, isn't it? Long phase. Yeah. But when I was 18, I left home when I was 18. I'm 42 now. And I left home because my mom basically made me homeless. And it wasn't about my sexuality that I was made homeless, but I think it's important to mention that there are lots of LGBT people who are made homeless after coming out, and they do experience financial difficulty. I'm also a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, which means that I've got other issues on top of, being a Black lesbian woman. I've also got issues with depression and anxiety and PTSD, which altogether is quite a lot.
Yeah.
And I was also a young single parent as well. My daughter's 21, believe it or not. And growing up with a young person, I experienced so many challenges, so many challenges. Even like just having to start life and experience homelessness was a challenge in itself. And then having a young person with me at the time was even more of a challenge. But even when I tried to better myself, I dug myself in holes. So I went to uni for, I think it was like in year 2001 or something. I went to uni to study, and at the time I was on housing benefit. And I didn't tell the housing that I went to uni, and I got the student loan and the maintenance this and the maintenance that. They paid my rent and everything. And then about a year later, I experienced some other issues in my life, and I left uni without completing. And then I got tons of letters saying, you owe this much to tax credits and this much to that and this one. And it was just a debt that it was huge. It was huge. And it actually took me about 10 years to figure stuff out and sort myself out. I was also a driver, so I had a car at the time. I still have a car now, but even things like having a parking ticket would send me into some sort of anxiety, because it's another thing on top of what I'm already facing. And because I left school so early in life and I left home so early in life, I didn't have any financial education. I didn't have the support of bank of mum and dad. My mum was a single parent. I didn't have my mum to ask, because we had our own issues that date back to when I was a child. But anyway, I didn't have her to say, Mum, lend me 20 quid. I need to put the gas on or whatever. Like, I never had those issues, those lifelines. So I've spent a lot of time figuring stuff out. And because we live in a society where people don't really talk about money and finances and stuff like that, you're just navigating this minefield. So it's really great that, what your debt advice company and what your My Money and all that does for young people, because it's really important. At the time, I had a really good housing officer that really helped me to really sort out my finances and sort out all sorts of different issues that I had at the time. But if I didn't have that person, I think I would have just sunk deeper and deeper and deeper into debt. And because LGBT people are more disproportionately affected by mental health, debt also has an impact on mental health and stuff like that. And luckily, I'm no longer in debt. I spent the whole of my 20s and 30s in debt, actually, because it's almost like once you're in it, you get sunk deeper and deeper into it. And then once you come out of it, like I fear debt now. I think the only debt I have is my mortgage, which is a good debt. But I actually fear debt. You know, I had that conversation with Renee when she was 18. I was like, when now that you're 18, you're going to have letters coming through the door saying that you can apply for this, this and this. Like, please don't apply for a credit card. I explained to her what credit is. I explained to her when she got her first job and stuff like that. I explained to her about portioning money aside for savings and stuff. Like, I've navigated a lot of this stuff by myself, and I've had to like pass on a little bit of what I know to my own young person. But it's been really challenging. It's been really, really challenging. There's so much to unpick and even talk about in that one little conversation that I've just had. But like, it has been really, really exhausting and challenging existing as a Black lesbian woman with all those intersections of my mental health and having a young child and all of that, who's now an adult. But I've learned a lot along the way. I've definitely learned a lot, and it's really important to have these discussions. I was even saying to someone the other day, like, I remember because I've always worked as well. And it's like the system doesn't really reward you if you work and you're earning like on minimum wage and you have to get topped up with tax credits. It keeps you in this little cycle. And I remember saying to someone this morning, because I was reflecting on the times that I called in sick for work a few times when I couldn't even afford to go to work. I couldn't afford the train fare one morning to go to work, so I called in sick. Like, imagine that. Like, yeah, it's a lot.
I suppose there's a message out there for employers as well. Like, how do you make sure that your employees, the life and soul of any organization, feel able, to be paid a decent wage so they can afford to come to work every day and feed their family, but also if they're struggling financially, how do you create a culture in which that you can turn to somebody at that organization and ask for that support? And you mentioned about your housing officer, right? Lots of us will have examples of that one person that understood us, that got us, and we got them and gave us that support. So I wonder for our kind of other panelists, who was that person for you, and what did they do for you?
Yeah, I think I experienced something very similar because I was a refugee, and so I came here. I don't understand how money works here, and also there's also the pressure. I don't know if people are first, second, or third generation. A little bit, you will understand this. The pressure of sending money home. And so that pressure was very much on me because, suddenly now you're in the abroad. You're rich. Right. And so everybody's expecting at the end of the month that you send money home. And I didn't have my papers at that time. So I was like working under the desk and like getting used and getting paid. And then I was staying with my boyfriend then because he has a house. So I was just hanging out and my salary was paid into his own bank account. So because I couldn't open a bank account. And then he suddenly died. And so his parent came, kicked me out of the house. That the son never came out to them that he was gay. So I was just a lodger, and it was my first winter here. So suddenly in the morning, the night before, I had a place to sleep. And then the next night, my first winter, it was December. I had nowhere to go. I just had a bag and I started sleeping rough. And that was the first time I know that people can sleep in those foam boxes. People can actually sleep in them. So you just capture yourself and get a blanket and you'll be cool. So that was what I was doing for some time. So I would just in the morning, in the daytime, you just walk around. Then few friends told me that, you can go to gay clubs in the evening and then go to parties. And then if you get lucky, somebody might take you home and then you have one bed and, one breakfast. And then I started going to gay clubs and it was happening, We danced, men will notice you and they will take you home. And you're not telling them why they're taking you home, And so when I got my papers, there was no explanation to what it means. Suddenly, I found myself being kicked out of the apartment that the Home Office gave me. I have to go and find my own apartment, got involved in sex work, was making money and all of that, and then got in debt. And it was really hard. I also went to school and then got student loan and just didn't know I couldn't pay. I couldn't do everything. It was just hard for me. And then credit card came. I don't know why they gave me credit card, but they gave me credit card as well. And then my mental health just because I keep getting letters, I keep getting all of these things, and I went into massive panic attack whenever there's a letter in my house. And then I was sectioned, kept at Ladywell Center for about a few months because I just lost it. And it was at that point that I met a Nigerian nurse. And I'd lost hope because then I was very suicidal, and it was suicide attempt that got me to the mental institution in the first place. And she just sat down with me. She said, "What's wrong? What's the problem?" And then she started crying. She was like, you are like me. Speak to me. And she spoke to me in Yoruba. So what's going on with you? And I just couldn't help myself. And that was the first time I could articulate what I was going through. The pressure, the demand and all of those things. And even when I was assessing mental health, they were not really helping because they didn't understand the cultural nuances too. I remember telling my mental health nurse that my counselor that I send money home, and she was like, "Why should you be sending money home? You should not be, I need to write this in your report. You should not be saying." You don't understand. You don't. And the way you're talking, you're getting me anxious because I have failed. If I can't send money home, I have failed. My life is worthless, right? And it was she, the nurse, who took it upon herself to help me to understand, to get control of myself, of my emotion, of my finances. And from there, she was able to link me up to different groups where I was able to freely express myself. And thanks to, there was RUCOS, which was a Black LGBT, a Black gay group. And then I joined other Black gay group where we can talk about our lives. We can talk about money. We can talk about relationship. We can talk about heartbreak. We can talk about all of those things. And gradually I started pulling myself out. So when we talk about intersectionality, you can talk about a Black lesbian in this country. Then you now look at a Black immigrant lesbian in this country. And there are all of those layers that comes into play that unless we understand the cultural baggages, and I'm very conscious of using that word baggage because what I was carrying were complete baggages, right? Unless you understand that, you can never help me offload them. You will never. What you're going to be doing in the process of helping me is like putting more weight on me and making me question myself. If not for that nurse that made it our unofficial duty to make sure that I get back on my feet, I don't think I will be alive today to be on this panel.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you.
I think just following on from that, although not sharing my own story, that was great. And thank you for sharing yours. One of the things that my bank does is we run specialist programs for refugee and asylum seekers out of our Westminster Money House, which is a physical space that people can come to. And it's in Westminster, but it's on Kilburn High Road. And the reason is because it's got good and easy access to Victoria Station, which is where is the entry point for lots of people who then need our support. So in terms of that intersectionality and in terms of the hero figure, the one person that normally guides you through, and most LGBT people that I've met will tell you there was someone. It's normally a teacher or a youth worker or a neighbor or whomever, an employer sometimes, etc. Sometimes our staff is that one person for somebody that's just arrived into this country who for the first time spends time with them to help them understand what is a pretty complex personal financial system and services. And everything that my bank is about giving people the tools and the knowledge to be able to navigate all the different letters and offers and products that get thrown at you basically as soon as you turn 16, really. And it just goes up and up and up. And so the amount of products that are out there available for people that can cause financial harm, things like buy now, pay later, which now if you go online and buy almost anything anywhere, actually the first option is buy now, pay later, then it's your debit card, then it's your credit card, whatever. So, but the fact that people come to this country never having interacted with that service or that system shows you where there is a potential problem. So I think it's for people who are in the sector, who are providing the support to go do the hard graft, get the funding for it, because we have to get funding for our programs to run them. And also for other people in the charity sector in particular who fund us to accept that there needs to be some movement in the way that we measure our impact and evaluation. We're sometimes working with people that don't speak any English. And so to even get them to open a bank account, it's a huge progress. They might not tell you what they liked about the quality of the course, but of course they tell you that they've now got a bank account, or they've registered their papers, or they've done whatever it is that we support them to do. We help people get into tenancy arrangements, etc. As well. The only other thing that I would say in terms of allyship, which was one of the questions from earlier that we've sort of tackled through our answers, is you could also be that guiding light for somebody. So, take it upon yourself to mentor someone, to coach someone, to be a good line manager, to be a good colleague, to take people when you see a change in their behavior or the way that they're presenting at work. So if they're being a bit more withdrawn, all the other things that you would expect, take them for lunch, take them for coffee. Don't pry. There is a difference between tell me what's wrong, as opposed to let's go for lunch and just catch up. There is something about being a friend to people, even if you're a colleague first, because we spend a lot of time at work and we spend a lot of time with our colleagues. And I know that you shouldn't always, cross the line, as it were, but it's a grey area. We all know that. People confide in you in work all of the time. So I would just encourage you to absolutely take that role, because you never know, you might have the same impact that nurse in one conversation had over here.
Yeah, I would like to add as well, actually, you've just made me think about something. I would like to add that we talk about privilege and power and stuff like that. And I think every single one of us in this room has some level of privilege and some level of power, regardless of what the intersections of our identities are. We all have some level of power and privilege, and it's up to us as individuals to help amplify the voices of those with less privilege than us. There's always going to be people that need our help and support. And I think sometimes when we think about allyship, we think, what big statement can we do? And sometimes it can just be just that little tiny thing, isn't it? Like just asking people, like, how can I help you? What can I do to help you today? And how are you? Yeah.
How are you? Just so simple to come break somebody down.
Yeah. I think we overthink a lot of all these conversations, and it's a lot to do with just like respecting people and understanding that people are coming from all walks of life. And it's just really important that we educate ourselves on the challenges that people face outside of our own experience.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, thank you for that. And in my opening monologue, I spoke around, I love Pride Month, love June every year as that month of that celebration. But I also look to the future and think we stand on the shoulders of all those that came before us and fought for our rights and the privileges that we have now. Outside of the day job here, I'm a school governor, and it's my secondary school. And I walk around the school right now and I see a pride flag on every door that everyone is welcome here. And that fills me with so much joy, because just, 20 years ago when I was at, that didn't happen. There was one out kid at school and he got ripped to, be careful, Matt, ripped apart from colleagues and indeed teachers as well. And so that journey has moved on. So as Pride Month comes to a conclusion, we look ahead. What do we see the future for LGBTQIA plus community and our rights? And as opposed to kind of a follow-up one, how can organisations like Toynbee Hall and our partners that we work here, what more can we do to keep driving that conversation forwards?
It's a big question, the future for a whole community, but I think it's going to be tricky over the next few years, because all I can see is an increase in momentum building to reverse everything that we've made progress in, not just in LGBT issues, beyond that. But if we just focus on that sort of rabbit hole for now, I guess that's the most useful thing for us to do. And I'm worried that in 5 years' time, all the graft that the right wingers and the TERFs and the anti-LGBTQIA people are putting in, we're not seeing it materialize yet. It's starting to. It's bubbling under the surface, as we can see with the commentary from the Prime Minister and others recently. But there are people who are younger, who are forming their opinions, listening to that all day, every day, seeing the headlines, hearing what people are saying, and there is a risk there. So I think one of the things that people like Toynbee Hall can do, or organisations like Toynbee Hall, us as individuals, my bank, whomever it is that's interacting with young people, is to be the antidote to that and to put on the celebrations and to celebrate Pride Month. And despite the fact that Pride is probably over commercialized in a sense, it's not when it's a little school putting on their first little Pride event and having the Pride flags that they have on the doors, because those little, the opposite of microaggression, what would that be? Micro-positiveness or something, I don't know. Those little micro bits of the rainbow that you see in schools and people celebrating what's going on in diverse, in different history months, etc. I think is probably one of the ways we can try and tackle that. But the other, I think, more powerfully is to vote with your feet, literally, and think about and assess when you're engaging with politics and politicians, when you're electing, think about the impact that it's having on other people. And if I could encourage you to even then think about, voting with your pounds when you're buying stuff and commercially interacting, have a look at LGBTQIA artists, makers, people because they're intersecting in all parts of your life. There's somebody I know who is a lesbian patchwork chair repairer and does awesome work with chairs. And it's like, actually, if you want a really nice chair, go and support her because she's amazing. So there are things like that you can do. And I think it's about a full sort of, if you can, come into the rainbow, as it were, and step into it fully. But I guess stand alongside us as we continue to take forward the fight against a pretty sorry picture at the moment.
I think life just goes round and round in cycles, doesn't it? Like, some things get worse before it gets better. But I have met lots and lots of people who are of that mindset of kindness and showing kindness in the world. And I think, as difficult as it feels for us LGBT people right now, there's still a lot more people recognizing the challenges that we face. And there are lots of people who don't identify as LGBT who are stepping forward and saying, actually, like, there's support in our community. I think organizations can have these conversations all year round. I think it's great that we celebrate Pride and have Pride Month, but our identities are our identities all year round. I'm a Black lesbian woman 365 days of the year. And as great as Pride Month is in terms of like the whole spotlight and everything, like, we need to have these conversations throughout the year. I think with organizations, they need to foster inclusive environments where their staff feel like they belong, because people are choosing different options for themselves. People are choosing to leave companies and organizations that do not support them in the way that they should. And, we're making decisions, and companies are losing really good people, and there is change. What I'm saying on that little rant or waffle, there is change happening. Change does happen. It does take time. And I think with the media, sometimes if you get caught up in what you're hearing and seeing and all of that in the media, sometimes it can really detract you from seeing what's actually really happening in reality.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think the future is great. And I always say that people think that maybe I'm high. Maybe I don't know. Maybe I'm on something. Yeah, but I just wanted to take from what you said, Andrea, because we look at what is happening in the US and with the emergence of DeSantis and his cohort of 8 merchants. And you kind of like realize that if these are the people that are going to shape the future, they're really not going to last long because they have no substance. Because you look at the politics of Trump and kind of unpack it. And I know we don't like to talk a lot about politics in this country, but I'm going to go there anyway. And possibly I won't get invited again.
Not at all.
But I mean, look at the politics of Boris Johnson. On the surface, is blah, 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 blah. But when you go deep, it has no substance. It has no foundation. And that was why it could fade away, just like it did. I mean, we've had many prime ministers in this country that have had the level of majority, maybe more, maybe less, but had that same impact of majority and have lasted longer. So, you can love her or hate her. You can look at Margaret Thatcher, love him or hate him. You can look at Tony Blair. And you could look at whether you like it or not. There's a little sense of substance to their politics. And the reason why the likes of Trump and Boris didn't really last long is because they're just like, they blow hot hair. And when you unpack whatever it is beyond the surface, it's nothing. It's just sinking sand. And I think that is what is going to happen. But what I'm afraid of is the destruction that they will leave in their paths, like, DeSantis is doing, with Florida, is that kind of destruction and that kind of hate ripple. But I also really am great to be living in a society where we have legal, remedies to all of this, like we've seen in the case of Rwanda and the deportation of asylum seeker too. I mean, who in their right mind would want to send people who are fleeing for their lives to a country where oppositions are killed and whisked away just like that? And, but what I'm trying to say in essence is that, the future is bright, but the future can't be brighter by what we do and what we don't do. And I think that is where the difference is. And what can you do, as an organization? Hosting events like this will really, really be great. But also there are so many groups that would want to meet, that will want to have access to spaces like this, to just sit down, just talk, but don't know that it exists or don't have the money to rent a space like this. Being very conscious of that and kind of proactively looking for groupings like that to say, you know what? I mean, I would love to, I'm a part of the African LGBT group, and it is a WhatsApp group, and we're over 70 of us. 90% of the people in that group just arrived this country in the last 2 years, right? And they have their claims with the Home Office that they've not even got their papers. And when they do, the challenges around how do I manage my money? How do I survive in this country would be something that will come. But if we can have a space like this, that kind of conversation with partnership like your organization can start even before you have your papers. You started thinking of that future, or, something for young trans people can gather and have conversation. I mean, to everybody that's sat in the audience, maybe you've learned one or two things differently than when you walk in through the door. And that is something that you're going to take with you. That's learning. And again, having this kind of event all year round, maybe quarterly, monthly, however your capacity is really going to change the kind of conversation that we're having within your community here. And aside from voting, I would encourage people to serve on boards of organizations. You have no idea how this can transform organizations and how it can inspire them to do something amazing. So whatever skills that you have, think about it. Look for a grassroots organization that might need your skill in communication, in fundraising, in financing, in networking. And you can use that even in political lobbying. And you can use that to help them get their message across, because there's so many people that want to get their message across, especially within the trans movement, but do not have the skills, do not have the people to help them. So volunteer, donate, organize event, sign petitions. People say it doesn't work. It still works. Sign petitions if you can, and together we'll make the future brighter.
Thank you. Pride parties every month. I'm down for that. Definitely pride parties monthly. We can.
Yeah, I think there's points in history where there have been times where things seem to be coming to a head and there seems to be a big pressure. And sometimes it's tipped to the worst, sometimes it's tipped to the good. And I think we're at a point now in history where we're seeing a real polarization between, for wanting of a better way to phrase it, woke and unwoke and all of these things. And we're seeing such a polarization on it. And I think now is a point in history where people need to take a stand and people need to say, like you were saying, if something happens, someone says something, just saying, I don't think that's okay, or I don't think that's right, or really, and just saying those words and actually challenging that is what we can all do, because there's something different about how things are evolving now, I feel, especially in politics in the US and in the UK. And there are countries that aren't like that and that haven't quite gotten to that point. And we need to start looking to those places and learning from them and thinking, how can we learn from those places so we don't go to this? Because where is it going to end? It's going to end really, really, really badly if we don't stop it now. And I want people to understand the seriousness of it, because I feel like people just sometimes want to bury their heads in the sand and don't think about it. But if it continues down the road it's going to end really, really badly, not just for disenfranchised people or minorities, but for everyone. Everyone's going to be impacted by it.
Thank you. We can get that brighter future, but we've got to fight hard for it, and we need allies to support us to get there. Thank you so much for all your contributions and discussions today. We could speak about, as you said earlier, we could speak about this for weeks. Maybe we should do an event every month. I might be down for that. But please join me in thanking my panelists today. So there's our comments. Before we wrap up, you know that events like this don't happen just by themselves. And very thankfully, I'm filled with a team of allies at Toynbee Hall, our working group that have put this event on. And as I sent a message round in all teams in, I said, I'd really like to do something for Pride. They all jumped at the chance. There was 11 people involved in putting this day on. So thank you to our Pride working group as well. All of the work that's gone in there. I've been reliably told to inform those that are staying for one more event, because there is 17 different things happening today. The MAL Money Advice Liaison Group is due to take place in the lecture hall shortly afterwards. So if you are staying, please join us for that. But otherwise, thank you for coming today. Thank you for being part of today's discussion. It really, really means a lot. And we will see you soon. Thanks again.